I was in the worst place anyone could imagine, hell. Despite having fame, money, and applause, I felt a deep emptiness consuming me from within. That void led me to this abyss, where I faced my darkest mistakes and understood what it means to be far from God. In the middle of my desperation, His love rescued me, giving me a second chance and a new purpose. Today, I'm here to share my story with you because what I learned can change your life. My name is Maria. I was born into a humble family in Guadalajara. From a young age, my mom, Doña Lupita, always taught me to pray before bed, to thank God for what we had, even if it was little, and to go to church every Sunday. I felt life had a clear purpose, to love God and be kind to others. But when I turned 18, everything changed. I was tall, slim, and had a face many described as perfect. One day, while helping my mom sell tamales in the plaza, a man approached me and told me I had a bright future. He claimed to be a modeling agent. My mom, ever skeptical, tried to keep me away from him, but I was intrigued. A bright future and the chance to escape poverty sounded like a dream come true. Gradually, I entered the modeling world. It started with small runway shows in local stores, then clothing campaigns, and within 2 years, I was featured in Mexico's top magazines. Cameras loved me, designers sought me out, and invitations to exclusive parties and events never stopped coming. Suddenly, my life was filled with luxury. Designer clothes, 5-star hotels, luxury cars, and applause at every runway I walked. But let me tell you something, the brighter my career shone, the darker my soul became. I stopped going to church. There was always something more important to do. My mom would say, "Daughter, don't let success distance you from God. Remember who gave you your talents." But I didn't listen. I thought her advice was for people who didn't understand how the real world worked. Now, I was ashamed to talk about my faith. I felt it didn't fit into a world where everyone only cared about fame, money, and power. Pride began to fill my heart. I looked down on others as if they were beneath me. I believed I knew it all, that I had gotten to where I was because of my own effort and beauty. I stopped calling my family, stopped visiting my mom. I thought, they don't understand my lifestyle anymore. We're not the same. At that moment, my world was filled with material pleasures, jewelry, expensive clothes, and trips to the most exotic places. But with all that luxury came temptations. I started going to parties where alcohol and drugs were normal. My friends, if I could even call them that, would tell me, "Relax, Maria. Enjoy your life. You have everything anyone could want." And I believed them. I convinced myself I was living the dream. But at night, when I was alone in those massive hotel rooms, I felt a deep emptiness, as if something inside me was broken. I didn't understand what was missing. After all, I had everything, right? But every time I looked in the mirror, I saw someone I didn't recognize. My face was perfectly made up for the cameras, but my soul was dirty, forgotten, and empty. God tried to speak to me many times. I remember one day, before an important runway show, an older woman approached me on the street and said, "Daughter, God has a purpose for you, but you're not listening." I laughed, thinking she was just another fanatic, but deep down, her words unsettled me. Something inside me knew she was right, but I didn't want to accept it. I continued advancing in my career, but every step toward success was a step further from God. I became a slave to my own image. Everything revolved around how I looked, how others perceived me. The higher I climbed in the modeling world, the lower I fell in my relationship with God. My heart, once full of faith and love, was now empty, filled only with pride and vanity. The worst part was that I didn't realize I was losing everything: my family, my peace, and my connection with God. I thought I was in control of my life, but in reality, I was falling into a spiral that would lead me to face the most terrifying darkness I could ever imagine. Let me take you to those moments. Imagine the bright lights, the buzz of the runways, the deafening applause. There I was, Maria, walking with my head held high as if everything was under control. The cameras captured every step, and designers hugged me afterward, saying, "You're the star of the night." From the outside, it looked like I had it all. But let me confess something. In those moments of glory, my heart was broken. Every night when the lights went out and I returned alone to my hotel room, the silence was overwhelming. The applause that had filled me with pride minutes earlier faded like a distant echo. I'd sit on the bed, surrounded by luxury, a minibar stocked with expensive drinks, dresses hanging in the wardrobe, and jewelry shining on the dresser. But none of it could fill the emptiness I felt. It was like a dark hole inside me that neither fame, nor money, nor parties could fill. I kept asking myself over and over, why do I feel so empty? I had million-dollar contracts, trips to the most exotic places, and friends many would envy, but those friends were only with me because they wanted something, connections, a photo with me, or simply to say they knew the model. They didn't care about me, they cared about what I represented. On those nights, the weight of my loneliness crushed me, and instead of facing it, I ran to the only escape I knew. Parties. They became my refuge. In those places, there was noise, laughter, music, and excesses. Everything seemed perfect, but if you stopped for a moment and observed, you could see the truth. Every face was masked with happiness, but behind the toasts and smiles were souls as empty as mine. Alcohol flowed like water, and I didn't hold back. Every drink was a way to silence my mind, to numb my broken heart. For a few hours, I could forget. But the next day, the emptiness returned, even bigger than before. That's when vices knocked on my door. I remember the first time a friend offered me drugs. "It'll help you relax," he said. Deep down, I knew it was wrong, but at that moment, I didn't care. I just wanted to fill that void inside me, even if it was with something I knew would destroy me. That was the first time, but not the last. Every line, every drink, every party was a desperate attempt to cover the hole in my soul. But nothing worked. Meanwhile, my mom, Doña Lupita, kept trying to reach me. From afar, she would call, send messages, and always say the same thing. "Daughter, don't forget God. He's the one who gave you everything you have." But I didn't want to listen. Every time she talked about God, I found an excuse to end the call. I couldn't face those words because deep down, I knew they were true. I knew I was far from Him, but I didn't want to admit it. How could I approach God after everything I had done? My relationships were also a mess. I got involved with people who only wanted to use me. They promised me love, but all they wanted was my fame. One of those men, a well-known businessman, ended our relationship by publicly humiliating me. He gave interviews and said horrible things about me. Instead of defending myself, I hid away. I was more broken than ever, feeling like I was worth nothing beyond the image and facade I had built. There were nights when I cried alone, hugging a pillow in an empty room. I wanted to scream, but I didn't know who to turn to. I had left God out of my life, and the friends I had weren't genuine. I looked at my phone, filled with contacts, but I knew none of them could help me. I looked in the mirror and saw a face perfect for the cameras, but the eyes staring back at me belonged to someone I didn't recognize. The lowest point came when I received a voicemail from my mom. Her voice sounded broken, as if she had been crying. She said, "Maria, daughter, I'm praying for you every day. I don't know what you're going through, but I know you're not well. Please return to God's arms before it's too late." That night, I listened to that message over and over. Each word felt like a hammer striking my heart. I didn't admit it at the time, but something inside me began to break. Instead of seeking help, I sank deeper. I thought more parties, more relationships, more fame would be the solution. But everything I tried only made me feel more lost. It was as if I were walking through an endless desert, searching for water in places where it would never be found. I was so blinded by my pride, so trapped in my mistakes that I couldn't see the obvious, that emptiness was the absence of God in my life. Now I understand. Now I know He was calling me even in my worst moments, but back then I didn't want to listen. I was so caught up in my own pride and pursuit of superficial happiness that I couldn't see the danger approaching. Everything in my life revolved around avoiding that emptiness that was eating me up inside. I believed I could fill it with more parties, more trips, more excess. In the midst of this blindness, I made a decision that would mark a before and after in my life. It was a sunny afternoon when I decided to take a trip to Acapulco. I had just finished an exhausting photo shoot and felt like I deserved a break. I was tired of everything, but I didn't want to admit it. I convinced myself that a weekend at the beach, surrounded by friends, music, and more parties, would be the solution to the growing emptiness inside me. I got into my car, a luxury vehicle I had recently purchased, a symbol of everything I thought I had achieved on my own, unaware that this trip would change my life forever. The journey started well. I was driving at high speed, with the windows down, letting the warm road air brush against my face. The music was loud, a playlist of hits I always used to motivate myself. My friends were following in another car, and we talked on the phone as we planned the night ahead in Acapulco. I felt invincible, as if nothing bad could happen to me, but I was wrong. As I drove on, the curves in the road became tighter and more dangerous. The sun began to set, and a light fog appeared on the horizon. Even so, I didn't slow down. My mind was distracted, thinking about the party that awaited us. At one moment, I picked up my phone to change the song. As I did, I lost control of the steering wheel. Everything happened in seconds. But for me, it felt like an eternity. My car started to swerve, veering out of the lane. I tried to brake, but the wheels skidded on the damp pavement. I screamed, but no one could hear me. The car spun violently, and in an instant, it flew off the road, heading straight down a slope covered with trees. The sound of metal crashing and glass shattering was deafening. When the car finally stopped, everything went silent. A silence more terrifying than the accident itself. I couldn't move. My hands were trembling, and a sharp pain shot through my body. I tried to open my eyes, but all I could see were shadows and flashes. I felt my life slipping away. In that moment, I thought of my mom. I remembered her voice saying, "Daughter, please return to God before it's too late." Tears began streaming down my face, but there was nothing I could do. My body was completely immobile. The ambulance arrived after what felt like hours, though I was later told it had only been minutes. They carefully pulled me from the car, but I was no longer fully conscious. I remember fragments. The flashing ambulance lights, the voices of paramedics saying my condition was critical, and the sound of sirens as they rushed me to the hospital. And then, nothing. Everything went dark. But it wasn't the darkness of sleep or rest. It was a heavy, cold, and terrifying darkness. I felt like I was falling, as if my soul were being ripped from my body and taken to an unknown place. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was trapped, enveloped in a despair I can't describe in words. It was a living, oppressive darkness, as if it had weight and wanted to crush me. I realized I was in hell, and there was nothing I could do on my own to escape. I had arrived at the place I had ignored so many times, the place I had denied, with my life full of pride and sin. Then, a faint light appeared in the distance, and a voice resonated, not with shouting, but with authority. It was a voice that shook me to the core and would change everything. Suddenly, everything around me changed. The suffocating heat and the screams stopped, but the darkness remained. It felt like being in a place suspended between time and space, where silence brought no peace, only an unbearable weight. I felt something calling me, something I couldn't ignore, and in an instant, I was dragged to a place that seemed like a courtroom, though it was unlike any courtroom of this world. Before me appeared a gigantic screen, but it wasn't a normal screen. It was as if the very air opened up to show me scenes from my life. Every moment I had lived began to play out, not as a distant memory, but as if it were happening in that instant. I couldn't look away, even though I desperately wanted to. I felt a mixture of shame and terror as I watched every decision, every word, and every action that had distanced me from God. First, I saw my childhood. There I was, an innocent girl with my mother, Doña Lupita, teaching me to pray. I remembered how she taught me to give thanks for each day and to trust in God. But soon those sweet images faded and were replaced by moments from my adolescence. I saw how my ambition began to grow, how my pride took control. I remembered when I stopped going to church because I didn't have time, and how I started lying to my mother to justify myself. Then came the scenes of my adult life, and they were even harder to watch. There I was at parties, surrounded by people who didn't care about me. I saw how I laughed at those who tried to talk to me about God, calling them outdated and fanatical. One scene in particular made me tremble. A man approached me during a photo shoot and told me that God had a purpose for my life. I remembered laughing in his face and responding, "If God exists, I don't need him. I make my own destiny." Seeing that scene, I felt a pain in my chest deeper than any physical wound. Another scene showed how I treated my mother. I saw how I ignored her calls when she reached out to see how I was doing. I heard her pleas, her concern, and I saw how I dismissed her as if her words didn't matter. I remembered a particular day when she called me crying, saying she was praying for me. At that moment, I coldly responded, "I don't need your prayers, Mom. I'm fine without them." Now, seeing that moment from this perspective, I could feel the pain I had caused her, and I hated myself for it. The images continued to show my life full of selfishness and vanity. I saw how I treated people I considered beneath me, how I filled myself with pride, thinking my beauty and success were solely my own doing. I saw how I relished the attention and applause while my soul became emptier and emptier. But the worst part was when they began to show me the consequences of my actions. I saw people I had negatively influenced, friends who followed in my footsteps toward perdition because they thought my lifestyle was ideal. I saw how my lack of faith and rejection of God not only affected me, but also those around me. Every decision I made left a mark, and those marks were deep, dark, and irreparable. I felt an enormous weight on my chest, as if every sin, every mistake, became a rock, slowly crushing me. I wanted to scream, to beg for forgiveness, but I couldn't. The words wouldn't come out. I knew I had no excuses, that I had had so many opportunities to change, and I had ignored them. At that moment, I truly understood what it meant to be far from God. It wasn't just emptiness. It was a self-imposed condemnation, an eternal separation from His love and grace. As the scenes kept playing, I felt a voice within me. Not an audible voice, but something deep that told me, "This is the result of your choices. This is what happens when you turn your back on me." It was the voice of my conscience, or perhaps God Himself, making me confront the truth of my life. I was completely broken, aware that everything I had valued in life, fame, success, beauty, was worthless in that place. The only things that mattered were what I had rejected: God, my family, and my true purpose. And the more I understood this, the more I feared what was to come next. I was completely consumed by despair, crushed by the weight of my mistakes, and enveloped by the darkness. The images of my life continued playing, reminding me of every selfish decision, every time I rejected God, every moment I turned away from what I knew in my heart was right. I felt there was no escape, that my condemnation was sealed. My screams were silent, and my soul was utterly shattered. Suddenly, when I thought I couldn't endure anymore, a light appeared in the distance. It wasn't an ordinary light. It was bright but didn't hurt my eyes, warm but not like the fire of hell. It was a light that radiated peace and authority at the same time. In that instant, everything stopped. The screams, the heat, the chains, even the images of my life. It was as if the entire universe had fallen silent before that presence. And then I heard it, a voice so powerful it seemed to resonate in every corner of my being, yet filled with love. "Maria," it said, pronouncing my name with a tenderness I had never felt before. It was as if that voice knew every corner of my soul, every wound, every fear, every mistake. "This is not your final hour. I wanted to respond, but I couldn't speak. My heart was filled with reverent fear, but also with hope. You have one last chance, the voice continued, to change and fulfill the mission I have entrusted to you. Those words pierced through me like lightning. A mission for me? After everything I had done, I couldn't understand why someone like me deserved another chance. The light began to approach, enveloping me little by little. I could feel it penetrating the deepest parts of my being, removing the guilt, pain, and despair that had consumed me. It was as if every part of me was being restored, as if that light was erasing the scars my life away from God had left. Listen, the voice said. I am not finished with you. You still have a purpose, but you must return with a new heart. You must remember what you have seen here and warn others. I will be with you, but you must choose me every day from now on and forever. At that moment, the light surrounded me completely, and the heat of hell was replaced by an indescribable warmth, as if I were being embraced by the very presence of God. I felt a peace I had never known. A peace that told me that although I had fallen so far, I was not beyond the reach of His love. And then everything changed. I felt a pull, as if something were bringing me back to life. The light dragged me out of that dark place, and in the blink of an eye, I woke up. I was in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines and the sound of monitors filling the room. My body was weak, but my heart was filled with something new. Hope. I knew what I had experienced wasn't a dream or a hallucination. I had been in hell, but God's mercy had brought me out. He had given me a second chance, and now I knew I had to make the most of it. I couldn't go back to being the same. My life no longer belonged to me. It was His. I slowly opened my eyes, and the first thing I saw was a white ceiling and fluorescent lights that seemed too bright. My body felt weak, as if I had been asleep for centuries. Beside me, I heard a whisper, and when I turned my head with difficulty, I saw my mother, Doña Lupita. I was on my knees next to my bed, hands clasped together, tears streaming down my face. I prayed softly, as if each word came from the depths of my soul. When she saw me move, her eyes filled with wonder and joy. "Thank God, my child, you're alive," she exclaimed, carefully embracing me. I couldn't speak, but my tears began to fall. I couldn't believe it. I was alive. I remembered what I had experienced, the dark place, the souls in torment, the voice that gave me a second chance. I knew at that moment I wasn't here by chance. God had given me a new life. The following days in the hospital were days of recovery, but also of reflection. Every time I closed my eyes, images of what I had seen in hell returned to my mind. The faces of people trapped, the screams, the chains. But I also remembered the light and the voice that had rescued me. I felt a mixture of gratitude and responsibility, knowing my life could no longer remain the same. One afternoon, as my mother sat beside me, I took her hand and with a weak voice said, "Mom, forgive me." She looked at me in surprise. "You have nothing to ask forgiveness for, my daughter," she replied, but I knew otherwise. "I abandoned you, ignored you, drifted away from God. Forgive me for everything," I said, tears streaming down my face. She embraced me and, through sobs, said, "God is good, Maria. He has always been waiting for you, and so have I." When I was finally discharged from the hospital, the first thing I did was make a decision I knew would change my life. I gave up my modeling career. I couldn't return to that world, the one that had taken me so far from God. It was difficult because it meant leaving behind million-dollar contracts, superficial friendships, and a life of luxury. But I also felt a deep peace, as if a massive weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Returning home, I found the Bible my mother had always left in my room, hoping I would open it one day. That night, I held it with trembling hands and began to read. At first, I didn't understand everything, but I felt as though each word had been written just for me. I spent hours reading, underlining verses, crying, and praying. I felt as if God was speaking directly to me, guiding me step by step toward the life I was meant to live. My mother and I started attending church together. The first time I walked in, I felt a mix of shame and relief. I sat in the back row, head lowered, while listening to the pastor speak about God's forgiveness and grace. It was as if the entire message was directed at me. At the end of the service, I approached the altar and knelt. I didn't say many words, but I cried like never before, asking God to forgive me, guide me, and use me for His purpose. I felt warmth in my chest, a certainty that He had heard me. From that day on, my life completely changed. I no longer cared about others' opinions, luxuries, or fame. My priority became rebuilding my relationship with God and with the people I had hurt. I began reconciling with old friends, asking forgiveness from those I had wronged, and sharing what I had experienced. It wasn't easy, but every step brought me closer to the peace only God can provide. Today, I spend my days reading the Bible, praying, and serving in the church. I help young people who, like me, have lost their way in pursuit of temporary things. I share my story, not to scare them, but to show them that God's love is so great that it can reach us even in the darkest places. I knew my purpose was to warn, guide, and show that there is always hope in Him, no matter how far we have fallen. After everything I experienced, I knew I couldn't keep my story to myself. God had brought me out of the darkest place, given me a second chance, and now I had a clear purpose: to warn others and show them God's love and mercy before it was too late. That's how my new mission began. At first, it was difficult. I wondered, who will listen to me? How can I talk about God when my life was so far from Him for so long? But every time I prayed, I felt His response in my heart: speak. I will be with you. So I started. My first invitation was at a small church in my hometown, Guadalajara. The pastor, a friend of my mother, asked me to share my testimony during a service. I remember how my hands trembled as I walked up to the pulpit. I looked at the congregation, at those faces full of curiosity and expectation, and took a deep breath. I began to speak, sharing my story from the beginning. How I had left God for fame. How I had lost myself in pride and vanity. How I had fallen into hell, and finally, how His love had saved me. As I spoke, I saw people crying, nodding their heads as if what I said touched their lives. When I finished, many approached me, thanking me for sharing my story. That day, I understood that my testimony was not just mine. It was a tool God could use to reach others. From there, more invitations began to come. Small churches, large auditoriums, even gatherings in public squares. Sometimes I spoke to hundreds of people, other times just a small group. But it didn't matter how big the audience was. Every time I shared my testimony, I felt I was fulfilling the purpose God had placed in my life. One of the most impactful moments happened in a plaza in Monterrey. There was a young man in the audience who seemed distracted, as if he didn't want to be there. But when I started talking about the emptiness I felt when I was far from God, I saw him lift his head and begin listening intently. At the end, he approached me and said, "It felt like you were speaking directly to me. I've been drifting away from God, but I want to change." That moment confirmed that every word, every effort was worth it. God also opened doors in the media. I was invited to radio programs and online interviews to talk about my experience. I used every opportunity to warn about the dangers of living away from God and to share the message of hope and redemption. In each program, I reminded people that no matter how far they've fallen, they can always return to the Father's arms. The path hasn't been easy. I often received criticism from those who said my past disqualified me from speaking about God. But whenever I doubted, I remembered what I had experienced, the voice that had brought me out of hell and the lives being transformed by my testimony. My mission wasn't to seek others' approval, but to obey God. Today, I continue traveling throughout Mexico, visiting churches, plazas, schools, and any place where I can speak. I carry with me a Bible, the memory of my experience, and a heart ready to serve. My message is always the same. God is waiting with open arms. No matter how long you've been away or how deep you've fallen, His love is enough to restore and give you a new life. This mission hasn't only changed others' lives, it continues transforming mine. Every time I see someone accept Christ, every time someone tells me my story inspired them to seek God, I feel a joy incomparable to anything I've lived before. I've found my purpose, and it's the greatest purpose anyone can have: serving God and bringing hope to others. That was my story, but now I want to speak to you. If you've ever felt lost, empty, or far from God, I want you to know it's never too late to return to Him. No matter how far you think you are, His love is greater than any mistake. I've seen it, felt it, and today I'm a witness that His mercy can transform any life. If you're here listening to this, it's not a coincidence. It's a call, an invitation to open your heart to Him and allow Him to work in your life. Because if He did it for me, He can do it for you too. Now, I'd like to hear from you. What do you think of this story? Have you ever felt identified with it? Leave me your comment, because together we can reflect and find hope.